So you care about public education in Georgia, but you feel like you really don't understand the landscape. How much money is being spent? How are kids doing? If so, let's say you're running for office or you want our lawmakers to better understand what's actually happening so that they can make for a better world, then I hope this is the presentation for you. It is my best attempt to give a survey of the landscape of public education in Georgia in under half an hour. So you might be wondering, who is this guy and why should I trust him? Completely fair. My name is Dr. Stephen Owens, and I got my doctorate from the University of Georgia, Go Dogs, focusing on education policy with an emphasis on state education finance systems. And I work at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and advocacy organization that I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. Let's get started. This is a survey of Georgia public education policy with an emphasis on funding for a couple of reasons. One, because I work at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. Our mission is to advance lasting solutions that expand economic opportunity and well-being for all Georgians. Budget is in our middle name because we believe that the budget is a moral document which decides who is left out and who is included in the state's wealth. And you can gain a lot of understanding of the state priorities around education by looking at the budget. So we are going to have a focus on this. And even though we are nonpartisan, it doesn't mean that we do not have a perspective ourselves. We absolutely do. We have a vision for Georgia that's fair and inclusive, where all people prosper. And I'll tell you right now, we strive to be anti-racist. We know that there have been generations of white supremacist policies that have kept out people of color from the state's wealth on purpose, and our work is to try to undo those systems. Let's get to the agenda. We're going to break it down into one, how are Georgia schools doing? Let's look at it through money, through student outcomes. What's missing? Let's assume that there is something missing, that there's a way forward. So we'll talk about what that is, and then how do we make things better? So how are things doing? How are schools doing in regards to the money? The total amount spent in Georgia, we're looking at around $20 billion. The state funding amount is about $2,500 less than the national average. This is even when you adjust for cost of living or regional differences. I'm getting all of these data points from the Education Law Center's Making the Grade report from 2021. Absolutely must read, especially if you have a focus on data and policy. And so absolutely check that out. A great resource. So that's the total amount. That's the adequacy that we say in education finance circles. Like, is the amount adequate to reach the goals that the state sets for its students? And we're looking at about $2,500 per child below the national average. That puts us at 38th, so in that bottom third of states. Next, is it fair? Because let's say you just give half of students tons of money. I gotta stop using my hands so much. Let's say you give half of students a ton of money, the other half you don't give them any, and the average for the entire state would look like, okay, you know, they're doing okay, they have a certain amount, but is it fair? Are all the kids getting like similar amounts of money, especially when you consider the research on education funding that shows that we need to be providing more resources to students, specifically students living in poverty. That's the number one challenge we know of inside the school. So we need to be shaping the way we fund schools in order to support these kids. And Georgia's system, compared to other states, is pretty fair, or it's fairer than the national average. You're about $1,000 per student more for high poverty schools and high poverty districts than for low poverty districts. That doesn't mean we're doing enough. It just means that like it's a flatter, slightly more progressive system, which is what you need to do if you want to make sure that all kids are succeeding at the same rate. So there you have adequacy, the total amount. Equity, are things fair for across the district, specifically for students living in poverty? And then finally, what does that look like in regards to how much a state could afford? That's the effort. When you look at the state's gross domestic product, the amount the state citizens produce, and then you look at how much the state puts towards public education, you can see where do our priorities fall. Georgia is about 29th in the nation, about 0.1% less than the national average. That would look like a few $100s more per student. And so that's where we sit, somewhere in the middle. We're not outstanding in any way. It's a lot more fair than other states, specifically other states in the Southeast, but it's not enough when you look at the national average. And even considering the national average, it doesn't mean that that average is somehow handed down from Mount Sinai, like, okay, we need to strive for the national average. Just a gauge that shows kind of how far are we behind our neighbors, especially as we consider a national and a global economy, wanting to make sure that our students can succeed wherever they go in the United States or internationally. So that's what it looks like money-wise. What are the results of outcomes? Like, how are kids doing? Because I think this gets to exactly what people want to know. Like, okay, at the end of the day, are our students able to compete? Are they getting the same education as kids in other states? There is no easy way to answer this, is what I'll say. There is this one test that's given out. I mean, there are several tests like this, but one that's kind of the gold standard in the United States. It's the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which tests a sample of students from across different types of districts, private, public, all across the United States. They get the same test, and then we can actually compare to other states and to prior years. If you look at NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress, if you look at NAEP scores, state of Georgia is about average. The important thing about statistics is that you want to take things from a nice broad view. And Georgia sits around in the middle, where there are not that many states that are doing significantly better than Georgia. There are not that many that are doing significantly worse. We are somewhere in the middle. You can feel confident saying that Georgia is doing well in the Southeast, but it's not like we're like completely outstripping all of our neighbors. Like, we're doing about on par with other states around us and nationally, so about average. One area that Georgia does stand out in, however, is the difference between how students who get free and reduced lunch do compared to students who do not get free and reduced lunch. So what does that look like? Kids from low-income backgrounds, compared to their wealthier neighbors, are doing much worse on state tests than every single state in the union. And the District of Columbia is the only one that has the larger difference. Sometimes people call these gaps, this idea that, like, there's a gap. But I don't really like that language, because gap sounds like, oh, it's there no matter what. We cause this gap. Georgia causes this gap by the way that we invest in these students, the way we educate these students. So this is one where we stand out. We are one of the worst in the nation when it comes to how our low-income kids do compared to the rest of the state. And so that shows in sharp relief. If we have about average test scores, it shows that our wealthier kids are actually doing quite well nationwide, and that our low-income kids are doing really poorly compared to the rest of the nation. So if you can isolate, in test scores, what's one area in need of improvement? It's how do we treat low-income students in our education system? All that being said, it doesn't mean that Georgia's not moving in the right direction. Georgia is one of only a handful of states that has shown progress on NAEP scores for reading, math. Our AP scores are going up. Graduation rate has been increasing significantly. If you take out the COVID year, and even if you include it, we're doing well compared to other states. But you can see this constant improvement across the board. That doesn't mean that we're outstripping those high performing states like the Massachusetts of this world. It means that we are improving in all these categories, which is a sign of, of progress, obviously. There's a ways to go, but Georgia is improving kind of across the board. I think that's worth celebrating. So that's how we're doing, money and outcome-wise. So what's missing? I showed you that difference in test scores based on students living in poverty and their wealthier classmates. I think it's important then to highlight that Georgia is one of only 6 states in the nation that does not provide any additional funding to educate students living in poverty. One of only 6. So this is important. The way that we fund schools in Georgia is that kids are paid based on the program that they're a part of. If you're in gifted program, you get a little bit extra money. If you are taking CTAE classes, if you're in younger grades, they get a little bit more money. If you're in special education, then you're allotted additional funding. The goal being that we want all kids to do well, but kids come from different backgrounds, have different abilities, and so we need to shape programs to support them. This has been true since the 1980s when this formula was written. If that's the case, and we know that poverty is the #1 challenge that our schools face, the differences and opportunities provided to a child who does not know where they're going to be spending the night that night, doesn't know if they're going to have a healthy meal on the table the next morning, might be dealing with toxic stress because of poor housing or a parent's job, which puts them in awful hours or incredible strain on their body or mind. That child is in the same classroom or in the same system with a child that has complete stability across the board that's afforded because of the wealth of their parents. Other nations have recognized this as well and provide a strong safety net if a parent loses their job, to support parents who've just had kids. Georgia does not have a strong safety net. And so you can see just the outsized impact that a parent's wealth has on a child's education. This is something that we have known about, Democrats and conservatives have known about for generations. But for some reason, we do not have anything that recognizes that need in the way that we fund schools. So if schools are going to do anything to support these kids, then they have to find it from other sources. And that makes for really uneven systems. One of the things that we talk about a lot in education, I think that's pretty common knowledge, is this idea of this teacher shortage, this consistent shortage of high quality teachers. Georgia is no different, but what I think is really fascinating is it's not necessarily evenly distributed across the state. This comes from a report, also from the Education Law Center. Again, I cannot sing their praises high enough, that was given this very detailed data on how teachers, just in this between these 2 school years, 2018 and 2019, how they behaved across the state. Because when you lose a school teacher, if you're a district, it doesn't mean that they are necessarily just leaving the workforce altogether or just leaving to go to the private sector or something like that. They might be leaving to go to a different school district. And when you look at state averages, that isn't really helpful because it doesn't show that there could be a lot of different things happening. And so these researchers broke the state down into 4 categories of districts. Majority Black and low income, low income but maybe majority white, wealthy districts, and then wealthy districts that are also majority white. And you can see, look at the majority Black and low income districts and compare that to the majority white and wealthy. I'm going to use my laser pointer here. Boom. You can see a completely different story between these 2 years. Majority Black and low income districts had 12% of their teachers leave at the end of the school year. About half of that left for majority white and wealthy school district. That's the same number that in our majority Black and low income districts transferred to another district. You can almost see this kind of filtering away from majority Black and low income districts to whiter and wealthier districts across the state. I believe that this is something that we could address if we provided additional funding to educate students living in poverty. We could provide more resources for those districts that are dealing with these challenges. We can incentivize teaching in these districts so these districts have high quality educators who have been in the classroom for a while, who are teaching in their field. Because without that, we're going to continue to see this attrition to honestly just like suburban Atlanta school districts. And those districts are great, I'm sure, but the state has to take care of all the districts in the state. It can't just say like, okay, good, this one school district is doing fine, or this group of school districts is doing fine. It is the responsibility of the state to ensure that all kids have an adequate public education. We can see this in other areas as well. This is based on a report that I'm writing right now on special education. There is a direct connection between how much special ed teachers are paid and how many of their kids are living in poverty. And you might just say, Dr. Owens, that must just be an example that these low-income districts have more kids, because low-income districts have more kids living in poverty. They have less money to pay for schools, so they have less money to pay their teachers. No, it is not. That connection does not show itself in the data. We see something unique here, that if you have teachers teaching more kids living in poverty, they are getting thousands less per year than special ed teachers in our richer school districts here. This could be the difference between deciding to stay around in the school district or transferring to another district. It could mean leaving the classroom. We know that we have shortages in special education. This is another reason that we need to provide additional funding to educate students living in poverty so that we can support a workforce, the accommodations need to serve these kids in special ed, gen ed, gifted, across the board. But that's not the only change that's needed. I talk about school bus funding a lot, and the only reason is because when I talk to school districts, they bring this up as an issue that has to be addressed. And so let me walk you through it. This gold bar is the amount the state has paid in school bus funding since the Clinton administration, fiscal year 2000. That is unrelated to the actual costs needed to bus kids to and from the school. Because since 2000, we have gained 250,000 students. The price of diesel and buses has gone up. We have additional needs in this area. Let's say in the year 2000, it was not expected that your school bus has air conditioning. You would be right to ask that in the year of our Lord 2022, but adding air conditioning onto a bus could be the difference of $20,000, $30,000. So as our expectations go up, as the number of students go up, as the cost to educate these, to bus these kids to and from school goes up, all of those costs go up, but the amount of funding stays the same from the state. So what happens is districts have to find this difference somewhere else. Look at this. This is an additional $450 million over like 20 years. Where are you going to find that $450 million? You got to find it in local property taxes. That's the important thing here, is that the state is not the only thing that pays for schools. If you look at funding, the federal government pays for about 7%. This is statewide across Georgia. The state pays for 50%. Local property tax is about 43%. If you cannot pay to buy new buses, because the ones you have now are like dangerous, if you cannot pay your bus drivers for the diesel with the state money you're given, it has to come from local property taxes. And those local property taxes are based on how much money the neighborhood has. It's the value of houses, it's the value of properties. And I think you understand that it costs a lot less to, let's say, live in southwest rural Georgia than it does to live in town Decatur. or to live in a nice suburb north of Atlanta. And so if it costs $400,000 to buy a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house in one district, and it costs $100,000 to buy the same size house, same amount of land in Seminole County, Georgia, that means that Seminole County just has far fewer property tax dollars to work with than, Decatur City Schools, Atlanta Public Schools has to work with. So maybe your richer school districts, your suburban, your in-town school districts can afford to make up that difference in school bus funding, but your rural, lower wealth school districts cannot afford that. So they have to pull that money from somewhere else. They pull it from the classroom. That is larger class sizes. So we need not only to provide additional funding to educate students living in poverty, we need to make structural changes to the way we fund schools to make sure that schools actually have what they need to educate children. And so how do we do that? You see I bolded here state government. I do that because the constitutional requirement to educate students in Georgia sits at the state constitution. That doesn't mean that local districts don't have a role to play. It doesn't mean the federal government doesn't have a role to play. I'm saying that the onus sits at the state. And the state cannot say like, oh, well, Forsyth County can raise more money for students, so good for them. No, that is a state problem. It's the reason the states consistently are sued for the way that they fund schools, because this is a uniquely American way to try to provide resources to children and have some of it based on how much money houses and properties are worth in that district. And so how do we make things better? We need to then advocate at the state. We need to make sure that state lawmakers feel pressure, Democrats and Republican, to do right by all kids. Well, what's one way to do that? Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, where I work, is the interim lead organization in Fund Georgia's Future. We have several organizations across the state that are in agreement that we need to create a just education system. So what does that look like? We need to have fair and full funding. You can read those commitments and we can talk about what it looks like to have a commitment to inclusivity, to acknowledging and dismantling historical systems of marginalization in education. But you can look at those and we can talk about them later. The important thing is that together we need to join our voices so that our lawmakers on both sides of the aisle recognize that they need to do right by our public school children, provide every single child the resources they need to succeed, to be able to follow their dreams, be able to chase their creative desires. And we're not going to be able to do that if schools don't have the money to support these kids. And so that's what Fund Georgia's Future is. We want to continue to push for fair and full funding. We have a commitment to maintenance so that we can actually maintain the system as we go, so that it can grow with the needs that might arise 5, 10, 20 years down the road. And so I would ask you, please consider joining Fund Georgia's Future. You can go to fundgeorgiasfuture.com, learn a little bit more about the coalition, about the work that we're doing, because we really think that there are millions of Georgians that care about our public school system and are ready to ask for more than just however much money is left over, then that amount goes to schools. And that brings me on to the next point about kind of like how do we make things better, is we have got to stop treating low expenses, low expenditures on our citizens as a good thing. The state of Georgia, when you consider state and local governments, pays less per citizen than every other state except one in the nation. And the reason is, it's not because we don't have a lot of wealth in the state. We absolutely do. It's that we give a ton of it away. We're talking billions in tax breaks for out-of-state corporations where there's zero expectation of a return on investment. It's one of the reasons the state of Georgia cut funding to public schools for 17 of 20 years. There's 2 decades where 17 of those years the state cut funding in the 2010s and 20s, 2000s, and in the teens. So how do we change? How do we get out of that cycle? We surveyed at GUPI school leaders. We do it every single summer and said, would you rather the state to continue cutting funds to schools or actually raise revenue to actually support school districts? 74% said raise revenue. And it's not like school district leaders are, a bunch of bleeding heart liberals who absolutely love raising taxes. This is recognition that the taxes are actually going to something that we support. Local public schools. You think about things about the fact that we have one of the lowest tobacco taxes in the nation. If we were to raise that to the national average, we could find $600 million next year. Do you know the amount of good that that could do to support our kids, specifically those kids living in poverty? That's one of the reasons I think that we see results like these. Also, we need to, once we collect this money from the citizenry, we need to stop siphoning it off to private schools. Georgia has 2 private school vouchers, Qualified Education Expense Tax Credit and the Georgia Special Needs Scholarship. Vouchers at their core are public dollars sent to private schools. In Georgia, we expect almost nothing from these private schools. We don't ask how kids are doing on state tests once the private schools get this money. We don't know if they are discriminating based on a child's ability or disability, based on the language that they speak at home, based on their religion, gender identity, sexual orientation. We know that private schools are discriminating based on these things, but for some reason, we continue to send public dollars to these schools and ask almost nothing in return. It hurts public schools that lose these state dollars when children take vouchers, because if you lose 5 kids to a voucher, you cannot cut off 5 seats of the school bus or turn down the air conditioning 5 students worth. You just lose that money, and it hurts the 995 kids that remain in the school. We have 0 evidence of success, and since 2008, the state has sent $1.2 billion to these programs. That is money that would be better spent serving all kids in the state, not just the kids whose parents can afford to send them to a discriminatory private school. So, recap. I know, I'm going like 2 minutes over my 25-minute goal. How are Georgia schools doing? And money, a little below average. Right there in the middle, maybe the top of the bottom third. But you can see that we're somewhere in the middle, a little bit lower than average, but a little bit fairer than other states. In outcomes, about average. You could make the case that we're an average plus, because students seem to be doing better across the board. You can see that we're improving in a lot of key areas. But what's missing is that support for those kids who are living in poverty, who need the most support. What's missing is structural supports to make sure our schools have funding for everything they need, like school buses, getting kids to and from the school. And how do we make things better? We have got to join our voices together. We have got to stop just waiting for the state to do right by kids, because it's shown that without consistent pressure, Georgia lawmakers will just continue with the status quo, which is we'll all be comfortable with teachers making about 80% of what their peers are making in other industries. We're going to continue to be okay with treating low-income kids as second-class citizens inside the school. And we'll continue to get the results that we get, which is kind of a middling system when we have these expectations for these kids to be world-class citizens, workers, neighbors. And so that's the Education 101. I hope to dive into more of these details further on, but I think that's a pretty good, of course I would think it's pretty good, but it's a pretty broad, but hopefully comprehensive review of public education in Georgia. If you'd like to read more about my writings around public education financing or can be found at gbpi.org. You see my email address if you want to follow me on Twitter or TikTok. That's Stephen J. Owens, and then there's an underscore right here. But that's it. All right, that's the best I can do. Let me know if there's one specific area you'd like me to focus in on. I hope to do a few more like these to get more into the weeds, but I'd love to know what you specifically would like some support on.